your kingdom here, let the darkness fear. Show your mighty hand.
I think Holly's going to help me. So Matthew 25, verses 14 to 30. For it is if a man going on a journey summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. The one who had received the 5 talents went off at once and traded with them and made 5 more talents. In the same way, the one who had the 2 talents made 2 more talents. But the one who had received the 1 talent went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. Then the one who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more talents, saying, Master, you handed over to me 5 talents. See, I have made 5 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. And the one who had the 2 talents also came forward, saying, Master, you handed over to me 2 talents. See, I have made 2 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. Then the one who had received the 1 talent also came forward, saying, Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, you have what is yours. But his master replied, You wicked and lazy slave. You knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one with the 10 talents. For to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken from them. As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.
I've known this parable for a very long time, as I'm sure many of you have. I always saw this passage as what God would do to those that don't believe in Jesus and who aren't using their gifts in God's kingdom. For the man that ended up with nothing, I used to believe that God was punishing him, basically for not doing what God was required. Unless you follow Jesus, using your talents, you would actually miss out, on God's grace. What God has given us, it's our responsibility to use it for God's kingdom or lose it. That's the way I always saw it. I chose to do this sermon today because this passage sat with me in an awkward way. And I saw that when you read it at the end, it's like, it sits in a really awkward position. We are told that God is compassionate. So would God really treat someone this way? So today I want to unpack some things and a different way of seeing this passage. So first of all, what's your talent? I think we all know what a talent means in the English language. Faye has a great talent for art, and Paul has a great talent for sharing an awesome sermon. We all know that. Okay, it is a parable, so figurative speaking, right? It's a fair assessment that it is talking about whatever form of riches we may have. It could be of physical money, it could be a gift of riding a bike, it could be how to care for the land, it could be sensitivity to other people. But I think we need to look a bit deeper into this parable. Put simply, a talent was about 20 years of a labourer's wage. A huge amount of money. Can you imagine if someone put that in your account? It would seem like almost more than Christmas, except we're not meant to say that, are we? I know I would definitely have a party right after paying off the house. Some might interpret this that God will make you rich and give you more if you have enough faith to do the right thing with it. And if not, well, he'll take it away. Otherwise known as a prosperity doctrine. We live in a culture where status is built on monetary wealth, and understandably, we need to be very wary of this. Money just makes so many decisions for us. Just this week, they talked about how Telstra was manipulating regional and outback First Nations people into phone plans that they couldn't afford. This was actually driven by workers given incentives to sell these very expensive plans. So they would tweak the paperwork so it would be approved. We are in a country that is so often driven by money. What I'm trying to say is that the bottom line is not the most important thing. So I want us to have a close look at the master in this parable. Particularly, I'm focusing at first on the Matthew version. So I always read this parable as God being the master, but let's take a closer look. In verse 24, it says, I knew that you are a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown, and gathering where you have not scattered seed. Does that sound like our God to you? It doesn't sound like our God to me. We know that our God does plant seeds in our hearts. But in the context of money, what we call good money management now certainly wasn't considered that back then. Back in Jesus' day, this would have been seen as greedy and taking away from honest, hard-working people. People taking more than what their labour earned them. What we need to remember that Jesus' time was driven by necessity. It's what you needed to live, to survive. If I can quote Midnight Oil, the rich getting richer, the poor get the picture. So the master discovers that the poor man has buried the money. And what's his response? Well, then you should have put the money on deposit with the bankers so that when I returned, I could have at least received it back with interest. This is what he punished him for in the most severe way. So what I've learned about this is that the master is punishing the servant for something that is actually forbidden in Scripture. The master expected him to go against Jewish law. In Exodus 22:25, if you lend money to any of my people with you who is poor, you shall not be like a money lender to him. You shall not exact interest from him. And then in Leviticus, I think there's many places, but these are just two examples. Leviticus 25:35-38. If your brother becomes poor and cannot maintain himself with you, you shall support him as though he were a stranger and a sojourner, and he shall live with you. Take no interest from him or profit, but fear your God, that your brother may live beside you. You shall not lend him your money at interest, nor give him your profit for food or profit. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. It was actually against the vibe of the Jews. The master was behaving badly. And then the other point worth making about this is that burying treasure was common at this time. It's hard to imagine what a bank would have been like back then. It would have been super dodgy. Of course people buried their money. But it doesn't end there. There's more about the master. We need to look at the same parable in Luke. It gives us a bit more detail. So in verse 12, Luke 19, verse 12, a man of noble birth went to a distant country to have himself appointed king and then to return. Okay, take that in. Interesting. Then in verse 14, but his subjects hated him and sent a delegation after him to say, we don't want this man to be our king. So it says, a man of noble birth. Then looking in the Bible notes, in the study Bible, it talks about how this is actually what Herod Archelaus did. After Herod the Great died, a tussle proceeded among the other Herods. So Herod Archelaus went to Rome to be appointed the emperor, to be the next ruler of the Jews. This actually happened not long before. So the Romans were oppressing the Jewish people. So as you can expect, they didn't like him. They didn't want him to be ruler. He was cruel, and with good reason too. He apparently massacred 3,000 people during the Passover. He was violent. So my question is, do you think Jesus would explain God to be like this? Like Herod? This was all fresh in their memories. Would Jesus want to identify with Herod? Yep, there's some helpful stuff in seeing how we can use our resources for God. And I'm not denying that. But in doing this, maybe we're missing something more in this parable. So what is this parable about if it's not about using your talents? So Jesus is definitely talking about the kingdom of heaven. He establishes that at the beginning of the chapter in Matthew. And he's talking to the disciples. If we agree that the master or king we are reading about doesn't fit into what we know and believe of Jesus as a loving and graceful God, where is the kingdom of heaven in this story? Well, Jesus tells us in verse 29 in Matthew, to all who have, more will be given, but from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. The rich getting richer and the poor get the picture. After hearing about the master, king, it changes the perception of the poor man. He then sounds like the good guy. There are a few things to note in relation to this. Point 1, remember the Beatitudes? Matthew 5:3. Jesus says, blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Point 2, Matthew is quite specific in stating that the kingdom of heaven will be hit. A verse that I heard about through researching this parable is Matthew 11:11 and 12. Truly I tell you, among those born of women, has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist. Yet whoever is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has been subjected to violence, and violent people have been raiding it. So Jesus said this in the context of John being in jail. Violent people have been raiding God's kingdom. That changes for me this whole basis of where God's kingdom is in this parable. All of a sudden, I am seeing that the kingdom in this parable from just such a different direction. That is God's upside down kingdom again. This just blows me away. Now, maybe the kingdom is the poor man who is punished. He is the wise man in this. Point 3. Hello. Another thing to remember, that Jesus is telling his parable in his last week. His last week. Can you imagine? He knew what was coming. According to Matthew, this is the last parable that Jesus says before he's betrayed. But also take note that point 4, straight after telling this parable, Jesus tells the prophecy of the sheep and the goats, where Jesus tells us that judgment is based on whether we saw and cared for those who are in prison, who needed food and clothing, for those that are sick. I'm sure many of you know it, where Jesus points out, Matthew 25:40, I tell you the truth, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me. So this parable, I think, isn't so much about using your talents, although we know we can learn something from that. But it's more about care for those that are forgotten. Care for those that are in positions of vulnerability. What I see in this story is two types of people, one driven by money, the other wiser man that has a different, wiser truth, following God's way. You could almost say it's a clash of cultures and ethics. So how does this fit with us now? We all know many marginalised groups that we could relate this to. But today you already know that we are focusing on our First Nations people in our very wealthy country. Again, I always feel I need to say this, but I'm not here to pretend that I get it right. I so don't. But I can't help thinking of how First Nations people look so beautifully after the land that sustained them, knowing all the subtleties of how this country worked. But reflective of the Master in this parable, we came and forced the First Nations people to live or die in a very different system. One that went against what they always knew to be right. One that sustained them and sustained the land. And boy, are we being shown up now. You know, with climate change being such a major issue, where all of a sudden people are wanting to draw on First Nations experience for managing fire, drought, nature. For our culture, money so often has been the most important thing. So when I read this parable, God isn't no longer the master. God's kingdom is with the poor man who had everything taken away and given to the rich. That's how the Juukan Gorge caves in WA were destroyed in search for iron ore. That's how many First Nations people die in custody. Like the poor man in the parable, Indigenous people are considered hopeless because their most important wisdom was not considered worthwhile. Paul started this service with an acknowledgement of the land we stand on. We've heard it said that this time in our church service is meant to be about God, not people. But the way I see it, for me, when I try to make my way through apathy, when we confront injustice, as our First Nations people have to, that is who Jesus identifies with. Jesus identifies with all those people that have lost their lives while in custody. Jesus identifies with our First Nations people that got taken from their families. Jesus identifies with those in the Torres Strait who may lose their homes due to climate change. Remember, Jesus didn't receive justice. He was killed because he saw things differently. He had a different perspective. We need to have a different perspective too. When we acknowledge the First Nations people, we are also acknowledging Jesus.
Show your mighty hand, heal our streets.